Hello and welcome to the Hibernation podcast. My name is Dahyo Lloyd, and I'm inviting you to join me for a weekly conversation with some of the amazing artists who've decided to stream with us over the course of the festival. Before we start the show today, we'd like to acknowledge and pay our respects to the custodians of the land upon which we stand. Wherever we are in this country, Indigenous sovereignty has never been ceded, and we must be mindful that this always was and always will be Aboriginal land. As we share and explore music throughout the festival, we are also on a site that carries the reverberations of many centuries of music and cultural making. Joining us this week is Alexis Weaver. Alexis is an electroacoustic composer based in Sydney. She draws on natural field recordings and the sounds of everyday objects to create adventurous radiophonic and acousmatic works. She has also composed soundtracks for animation, short film, radio, theatre, and dance. Alexis's work has been broadcast in Australia, the US, France, Scotland, and Scandinavia, as well as featured on New Weird Australia's Solitary Wave and RMN Classical's Electroacoustic and Beyond 2. Alexis recently completed a Masters of Music at the Sydney Conservatorium, where she now teaches composition and music technology subjects. Her research is focused on the transferal of high-quality acousmatic music to everyday portable diffusion systems, and she's named this new movement Small Diffusion. Two acousmatic works produced during this time were awarded highly commended in the 2020 Arts Electronica Forum Wallace competition in Switzerland. In 2021, she joined the Nanosonic Stories research team at the University of Sydney, working on ways to effectively communicate nanoscience concepts to HSC students through sound. Other recent achievements include a commission work for the 2020 Glasgow Radiophrenia Festival and several projects exploring live electronic performance and collaboration. Alexis was also the co-founder of the Sydney composer collective Lost and Sound, which staged events for emerging experimental artists from 2016 to 2019. How are you, Alexis?
I'm very well, Dahyo. How are you?
Not too bad, thanks. How's your lockdown going so far?
Lockdown has actually been quite okay for me, just in terms of like my kind of professional experience and my living situation. I'm so lucky to be living kind of in a compact one-bedroom apartment and alone, and I have my space. I also have a lot of green space around, so I've never had to feel claustrophobic or like I have to fight with my mum or something. And yeah, you almost feel bad saying it, but my experience has actually been pretty positive on a day-to-day level, I suppose.
Yeah, I mean, you say you feel bad saying it, but I think it's better to say that you've had a all right time than to pretend it's been terrible when it hasn't, you know?
That's absolutely true. Yeah, I feel like I'm in a very privileged position in my little flat here.
Yeah, I understand how you feel. I've been the same.
Yeah, yeah.
I mean, partly because I'm still making money and
Well, that's
and all
it.
of that, right?
Exactly. We don't need to. I mean, because I'm teaching from home, and I'm lucky that the NBN came through for me as well. I haven't had to really venture out all that much. So
yeah, so it's been sort of peaceful, I guess.
it has been peaceful. I think that's it. It's been the kind of cottagecore peaceful scenario that everyone dreams a lockdown of being. So yeah.
Yeah, well, I mean, I guess it's a good time to sort of take some time and reflect and all of that stuff. So you've been teaching. That's at the Sydney Con.
That's right. So I've mostly been doing teaching with the Sydney Conservatorium of Music, tutoring in the undergraduate composition degrees. I've been doing a little bit of tutoring just privately as well, so helping students with music technology concepts and getting up their technical chops.
Oh, cool.
And I'm also teaching as part of the design postgraduate design course over at main campus, and tutoring with my good friend Megan Clune in the sound design for new media subject over there as well. So it's been quite a varied kind of tutoring menu this semester, and it's been really good.
That's quite nice, to be honest, though. It means you're not just teaching the same thing every day, like
Exactly.
5 times a week.
Yes, I'm actually learning in the process as well.
I think that's the best way to teach.
Yep.
I feel like a lot of the time, some of the best teachers that I've had have been sort of not necessarily people who are experts at what they were teaching, but people who were, they weren't a dictionary or the internet, but they were people who would sort of help you work through problems and all that sort of stuff. Because I think that really helps you then go on to be able to, go out on your own and to look for things without having to ask someone all the time.
I think that's a good way of like describing a good teacher for me as well. I would agree with that. It's about, I suppose, enthusiasm and being a sort of conversationalist. I think it's about being able to, well, especially in creative applications, being able to bounce off ideas with each other and have that sort of level of almost non-hierarchical kind of conversation where someone can bring up an idea and you can say, oh, well, you know, this isn't the way that I would look at it, but it's not necessarily invalid, or maybe steering students in a certain direction but not always telling them what to do and letting them figure it out for themselves. That's kind of the way I've always wanted to teach. And I think that when you're not talking about the very basic technical stuff and the do's and don'ts of like working in music technology, once you get past that and you start talking about the creative interpretation of these materials, that's when things, I don't know, the rules can kind of fall down, and it's about just letting people explore. And then if it's getting really out of whack, just say, well, maybe go down this path instead, and then just letting them run off that way. That's the fun stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. I think also just when it gets to that point when you're sort of past the do's and don'ts and the sort of right and wrong Boolean sort of answers, I guess, once you're past that, I think it's where it gets interesting, but it's also sort of where it gets difficult, because if there's no right answers, then how are you supposed to sort of, I've always sort of struggled thinking about that. How are you supposed to,
how do you teach?
Yeah.
Yeah. And is it teaching? Is what you're doing teaching when you're tutoring? Well, especially at a tertiary level in music, and especially with more experimental and electronic music, if you're working like I am in that sort of electroacoustic and acousmatic tradition, where there are a lot of historical opinions, but there's not necessarily rules. Is it teaching, or is it just having a conversation, having a passionate conversation with like-minded people? So it always seems like a pretty good deal on my end that I get to do that. Not necessarily have many answers. Yeah.
Well, just being able to talk about stuff that you're passionate about and getting paid for it is not a bad.
It's the dream, isn't it?
Not a bad gig, is it?
Yeah, exactly.
So you teach. The majority of your stuff is electroacoustic.
Yes.
And sort of related to music technology and that sort of stuff. How did you end up going down that rabbit hole?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So to answer it, I kind of have to go back to me starting university. So I decided that composition was where I wanted to head. I really liked making music, and I actually started out with very rhythmic and percussive music when I came into the conservatorium, because I really kind of vibed with the idea of rhythmic and very timbrally interesting works. But then ended up kind of learning more about I don't know, harmony and tonality and all of those musical concepts that I wasn't super interested about coming in. And I thought, oh, okay, well, I'm going to write lots of flute music and it's going to be very impressionistic and it's going to be gorgeous. But that I wasn't good at it. And I sort of started to question what on earth I was doing. I didn't feel like I was really at the same level as my peers. And I couldn't seem to get the ideas I had in my head down on the page, and it didn't work in that way. But then we're forced in second year to do electroacoustic courses, and I didn't want to at all. But then as soon as I kind of forced myself to do it for a good grade and get involved in it, I realized, oh my goodness, we focus more on gesture and this feeling of physicality in music, and pitch means something different in the electroacoustic sphere, or it can. And suddenly it worked a lot better in my brain, because I think I see music as different cells, and I especially resonate with the idea of frequency rather than pitch. And I didn't realize that, and I didn't really have the words to articulate that, but I was lucky to have a very good one-on-one teacher and mentor in that time where I was transitioning that kind of mindset. And so I really, after 2015, which was my second year of study, I never wrote an instrumental work again. And this is coming from someone who had no music technology background. had the same Windows computer since about year 7, so there was a lot to adapt to, and I'm still adapting. I'm still catching up 8 years later, but that's how I got into it, and so I never really looked back. It was really nice to feel like, oh, I actually get this, and I feel like I'm at the forefront of where I could be at this level by doing this music, and not necessarily even in an excellence way. I'm not saying that what I was making was excellent, but in terms of understanding it and feeling like it kind of flows through you and you get it, that's kind of where I felt. So, and that I've never really doubted that, and so I've always felt like I can be passionate about it even when I don't necessarily understand the aesthetics of a genre, or I don't super understand where someone else's inspiration is. I'm always going to be interested in it, and I think that maybe that passion is what got me into teaching, because I've always been willing to kind of, even if I can't understand something or if it's not really my aesthetic, I've always been willing to learn more about it and just encourage others in electroacoustic music. And I think a lot of the time it's that passion and it's empathy for people who've never done it before that is quite important when they're just getting into it, and it's all very new and different and makes absolutely no sense to someone who plays the flute, or, you know, someone who plays the guitar and can't even imagine just like recording an oven door and using that as music or something like that. Yeah.
I mean, it's interesting that you say that, because my second year experience of going to the con was, you know, I came in with a classical piano training. I was terrible at classical piano, so I stopped doing it.
Oh, same.
Yeah, God. And then I had you as my...
Hey, what an experience for you.
God, it was a good one. But I mean,
you.
I had never written electroacoustic music before, but I sort of really just got interested in it. And
Yes.
I think a large part of that was, I mean, you talk about new things and not making sense. Well, I just decided to jump in the deep end and go with Max MSP.
Yep, you really did. You really did.
And just sort of went down that bloody rabbit hole. And I don't think I've ever looked back. And I think part of that was because we had these sort of long conversations about how to approach the software and how to write music with software and all that sort of stuff. And it wasn't so much like, this is a trigger object, this is a metro object. It was more like, this is how you should think about sculpting sound.
Yes. It was very theoretical, wasn't it? And you were like the perfect case study of this, because it was 2018, I think, when you were in second year, and you were in my first semester. I
think it was
my
2019,
first batch
actually.
of students. Oh, was it? Okay.
Yeah.
You were one of my first batches of students, maybe first or second semester when I was coming in, and I thought that you said to me the first lesson almost, I want to learn Max, and I thought, oh shit. That's really interesting, and that's fantastic. And I could see that with the kind of influences that you had and where you wanted to go, it was like, there's no way I could ever talk Dahyo out of this, even though I respect Max as a program, and I think that it does amazing things. But for me at the time, it wasn't what I was super interested in. I was very much in that Dennis Smalley acousmatic theory of gesture and space sort of mindset. And I used to kind of try and teach what I knew. But with you, and I was very lucky also that you responded to what I could teach you well, and you were also very independently focused. Like, you actually went away from the lesson and you thought, okay, well, we talked about listening to music in this way, and maybe this part here needs some, I don't know, high frequency content, and then you actually figured out how to do it practically. So that was lucky for both of us, I think, that you were that student, but you kind of treated it as a theoretical discussion in our classes, and then you went away and did it. So thanks for that.
No worries. I mean, like, I got a lot out of it, and I think the thing that was sort of really interesting about that whole experience of learning quite a complex software with someone who is not a specialist necessarily in said software, right? I think the interesting thing about that was, with these sort of quite technical things, a lot of the time the best way to get good at stuff is you just have to spend a lot of time in the software, right?
Yes.
And I don't think that's a Mac specific thing. I mean, I think that's with a lot of things in general, but in particular in electroacoustic music. I mean, like, if we think about mixing or sound synthesis or, you know, just how to use a DAW, I think a lot of that just comes down to you got to put the hours in the
Yes.
program.
You have to be resigned to putting the hours in, and I think that it can't be that goal oriented. I think you need to, as some people say, make space for the struggle with music technology. And I think that there is a lot of pressure at times when you're starting out at something to get it right away, or there is an expectation that we're going to be able to get it right away. But if you are there for 2 hours in one day and you say, well, the end goal of this is for me to just spend 2 hours in this environment, not even necessarily to take in anything into your head, you can tick off that goal of the day being, I spent 2 hours in this and I explored all the things that I can do. None of it went in, but I'm going to try again tomorrow. And by the end of this week, maybe I will be a lot more familiar with this. I think we've got to do that sometimes.
You sort of get these little you sort of form these little pathways in your head, I think.
Yes,
Just
idiosyncratic pathways.
And I think like it's a lot more valuable, honestly, I think, to have a teacher who isn't, I mean, I learned how Max works through bloody YouTube, most of it, right? And that's what YouTube is amazing for, is it can teach you all that technical stuff. And I think like really you get a lot more out of having a teacher who makes you want to put that time in and learn the technical stuff, but then also sort of teaches you stuff that YouTube doesn't cover, like sort of like gesture and sort of all these higher level ideas, I guess.
Like navigating through it creatively. And there's so much value in both, and I think that a truly perfect teacher is someone who can help you with the technical stuff, and someone who can then show you how to interpret it, right? It's always about the learning of these building blocks and then application of it. And I think that for me in that semester, I like talking to you about the application of it and how we might actually use these things you've learnt to make something meaningful. And again, you were really open to that, so we both got lucky there, really.
It was, I think it was just like right place at the right time sort of thing that was going on.
Totally.
I think that's, well, I mean, I've just been a Max nerd since, right? So, I mean, obviously I got something out of it.
Absolutely. Well, yeah, that's fantastic as well. Like, this is what I mean, and this is kind of what happened to me in second year. I was studying with Ivan Zavada at the time, and he went really hard on the acousmatic kind of breathe with the music, feel the gesture and the source bonding of these sounds. And so that, luckily for me, is what I've really held on to, and that's moved me through the past decade of my life. And I think, like you say, I also got lucky in that I had a teacher who would teach me the basic building blocks, but then also very specifically taught me how to see music in a different way and to really think about the creation of it. So I think a lot of my trajectory has been luck and just being in the right place at the right time. So, but it's funny how that second year, and I know this is a very conservatorium specific conversation, but how that second year is so important to throw you into something that you wouldn't necessarily actually choose for yourself.
Absolutely. I mean, I can't really imagine nowadays, I don't know, can you just writing a piece exclusively for acoustic instruments with a score and then having people play them?
I don't think about music in a note specific way anymore. Like I mentioned before, for me, music is very much about structure and layers and cells of sound. So I think that I don't particularly even think about sound in terms of notes, and I think that reflects what I do a lot, what I'm familiar with, but it's in terms of sound objects. So even a melodic line and a counter melody, to me, those are, in my mind, how I would visualize them is more like an extended sound object interacting in an environment that I would notes on a page. And I think that that's maybe the difference between electroacoustic music and instrumental, if you want to separate them in that way, and I personally do. It's sounds existing in a certain environment versus an arrangement. Yeah.
Have you, so you say that you think of sounds in this sort of like block way almost, you know?
Yes, almost like Tetris, I guess.
Well, I mean, honestly, it sounds like the way you describe it sounds like what imported samples look like in a DAW, right?
That is it. That is absolutely it. Yep.
And do you think that way of thinking about sound and music, do you think that comes from the amount of time you spent in DAWs, or do you think it's like that was there and then DAWs sort of seemed to fit, or do you feel like it's a bit of both?
Yeah, such a good question. I think it's a combination of both, because before I got into electronic music, I still relied very heavily on the visuals of composing software like Sibelius in order to put together textures and sort of this layering of instruments. And I remember always being taught, and you might have been the same, they might have taught, try and listen to it in your head before you notate anything, and don't have that visual feedback as you're playing through. And, you know, an extension of that, don't play back what you've done in this composition software too much, because then you're relying too much on this external feedback rather than this idea of, you know, composition that you have within yourself. And that didn't work for me at all. So I think getting into a DAW, visually, it just spoke to me, because on some level I did think of music as sound objects without even being able to have those words to articulate it. And I am also someone who needs to listen through something quite a bit and have it played back over and over in order to really understand the flow of it, which I think doesn't completely make sense, but for some reason that's just what works for me. So it suited my way of working and it suited my way of processing information. But I also think that the tools you use, as much as we develop tools develop us. So the fact that our Western DAWs are kind of set in this way, and even the interface itself, I think it's absolutely molded the way that I listen to and process music just in my brain every single day. Yeah,
I think that's really interesting, the sort of idea of how technology can affect the way that you write, you know, the way that you create. And I mean, you mentioned Sibelius, and like if I do have to write a score out, I am one of those people who writes it out on paper and then like puts it in the software.
Yep.
The reason is that Sibelius sucks.
That was always my general impression. But
yeah, I mean, I don't think I've ever met anyone who's passionate and likes Sibelius. You know, people put up with it.
Imagine
like,
if you did, though.
Bad bunch, but
wouldn't that be a wonderful bio? I'm passionate about Sibelius.
Yeah, bloody hell. But it's like, I guess that's the interesting thing about design of these softwares, right? Is that you will find some like workspaces such as Sibelius that are, I mean, I've used it for years, I'm pretty fast at it, but I still pretty much every time I do a score need to Google something.
Yes, right.
And that is a frustrating experience that puts you off the creative process. Whereas for software that I'm more comfortable with, like Max, for example, or for you, I'm assuming Ableton or Cubase, you know, that sort of stuff. It's like, yes, sometimes you need to look up specific things, but it doesn't feel like it's impeding the sort of creative process.
The flow, that creative flow, I understand. And I mean, for you, obviously, I mean, Max is so modular on such a like tiny, minuscule level. Like, that's such a different way of working. And that must be involving so many different kind of pathways of creativity. So you can probably comment on that quite a bit, I assume. I mean, do you feel like do you approach things differently, or do you feel like inspiration comes to you in a different way once you're kind of in that environment?
It's not, I guess it's like Max has sort of changed the way I write, because I don't often sit in front of a blank patcher and know what I'm going to make.
Yes.
You know, it's like often I'll be doing something and then I'll patch something into something else. It creates this sort of interesting effect that I wasn't expecting. Like, oh, well, let's experiment with this, and it sort of grows. It starts small and it sort of grows out like this big sort of amorphous
tumor
blob thing, you know?
Yeah,
exactly. Whereas, and I guess this is why personally I haven't done as much with the automation lines and the
Yep.
DAW sculpting is that seems to be a different way of looking at it. You know, like
Totally.
it seems like more of a top-down way of approaching, and this is like within electroacoustic music, right?
Yep.
But it
Yep.
seems like a bit more of a top-down way of approaching a piece than a bottom-up sort of.
Yes,
sort of
yes, that's probably a good way of thinking of it. I hadn't considered that, but for me, automation and the drawing of these curves and these lines is like probably one of just the core kind of principles of what I create. Because a lot of the time, I'm not even processing things. I'm chopping up the same amount of audio and then using levels. And I mean, all of this is very, very different than, say, someone is a live improviser and then they record their output, and the way that they're exploring you know, some sort of physical interface is going to be very, very different. So it's just fascinating, isn't it, that there's so many ways within even, I mean, a broad umbrella of experimental electronic music, that even in these really basic kind of tools that we all know and we kind of all use, there's so many pathways for using them, and that's why it all sounds so different.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's an interesting thing when, I mean, and this is just within like the electroacoustic discipline even.
Yeah.
But I think it's interesting when you talk to different people who are writing and sort of creating this sort of music, and you see that everyone's creative process and the way that they sort of look at creating things is sort of, it's different, and it produces wildly different results, which I think is really interesting.
That's right. That's right. And it's also about restrictions, I suppose. So if we weren't taught a certain technique, or we prioritize some sort of other plugin or one particular program, then you grow around your limitations and you learn the shortcuts and you learn ways of getting around what you don't know without even really knowing that you're doing that. And that in itself, those imperfections of our workflow and the ways that we as individuals kind of adopt or throw away different shortcuts and more convenient ways of doing things, that also throws up really interesting deviations in our creative practice. And so, for example, for me, I used to be a very, very passionate kind of debater when it came to the amount of plugins that you had to buy and the equipment that you had to have. And I'm much less argumentative about it these days because they're amazing. But I really like the idea of restriction, and that's also a very acousmatic sort of way.
Also good for your wallet.
Yes, that is undoubtedly the first reason. But I like the idea of restricting yourself and not having too much choice, because I think that is how you figure out what you need as an artist and what you can do with the most limited set of materials and tools that you have, is where you kind of distill down your creative voice. Yeah, I've just decided that right now, but I think that's very true. Yeah.
I think when you're talking about sort of restrictions and how they're helpful, do you feel like, I mean, thinking way back to your first experience with electroacoustic software and all of this sort of stuff, did you find it terrifying when you opened up your DAW and you just saw like the empty timeline with nothing in there, and it's like, well, how do I start, you know?
Yes, I think it's terrifying because it's like a book you don't know how to read. There's no significance in any of these buttons and none of these lines. Like, what are track lanes? What the hell is that? Like, it doesn't make sense because it's so unfamiliar. And I think that's why when you're starting out, especially, it is important to kind of say, well, I'm learning this set of, I don't know, DAW techniques today, or I'm learning what this means, and I'm going to see how much creativity or how much material I can get out of exploring just one thing. And again, I mean that, like I said before, it's a super acousmatic approach, but just to learning as well. It's this modular kind of, let's see what the hell can I do with what I know, and is that going to be creatively valid? And if it is, then, well, that's really cool, and I've probably learned a lot more about how I work and what is important in electronic music as well. Is it the amount of sounds? Is it the amount of different techniques? Or is it the behavior of sound? Is it how you've used it and the choices that you've made? And can you do that when you only have a very limited set of sounds and tools to do that? And I think probably I don't necessarily think that we listen for like variation of sound. I think it's about listening out for behaviors in sound, and it's the way that we chart a pathway through time with the music that we're creating. And you could do that with one kind of just like sustained note and a cutoff, a filter cutoff, you know, and there's so much that you can do to make that evoke you know, real world behaviors, or evoke a certain animal or a bird call. And that could be super interesting, just exploring that and, you know, duplicating that sound for 20 minutes. And in theory, all you need is like, I don't know, Audacity to do that.
Audacity's great. I love Audacity.
I need to do more in it. Yeah. Yeah, what a rant. But that's what I feel about restrictions. And I just don't think that it's the most important thing to have everything. It doesn't mean that you're not a very established or a good electroacoustic composer or creator.
Absolutely. And I think also it's a bit of a trap when you are when you are new to things. I mean, I am not a good mixer.
Right.
And I have still been tempted to buy bloody really good plugins, like really good compressors, really good reverbs, all this sort of stuff.
Yeah.
And it's like, well, this will make my mixes better. It's like, no, it won't. This will make my mixes worse because I'll freeze up because there's too many options. I'm like, well, which of the 10 compressors that I own can I, you know?
Paralyzed by choice. Yeah, totally.
And when you're not proficient to begin with, I think that's an issue. So I think it's interesting, this sort of idea of like how software speaks to you.
Yes.
Depending on how familiar you are with it.
Yes, totally. Yeah. And where you start, because there's a million positions that you could start from, and like navigating out from that position, I think also changes the way that you use it. Yeah, it's a funny one. I'd really like to find out more about education in music technology, especially, because I think it's a good example of this. And I'm sure there are many other examples in different disciplines, but how the mind works as we listen and work through music technology, and how it actually shapes you and your creative practice and the habits that you get into could be quite interesting.
Absolutely. I mean, I just think it's almost an interesting psychological sort of thought about how this sort of freedom can affect you or otherwise, you know?
Yes. Yeah.
And I mean, that's the great thing about music technology, is that it has led to us being able to create all these new sound worlds that wouldn't have been possible beforehand.
Yeah, indeed.
But at the same time, it's like it freezes us up because we don't know which direction to go.
Yeah, that's it. I think that we focus on different kind of aesthetic priorities now. And I think that's true across all music. I think that we have so much more to play with than we did before. But yeah, does it mean always that we're making better music? I don't know.
Not necessarily. I mean, it means that we have the option to try new things, which I think is exciting, right?
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. No, I'm always an advocate for innovation. Yeah, but it is interesting to see how we use it. And I know a lot of people who are a lot younger than me who have a lot better equipment and a lot better software. And I always wonder, like, well, I mean, they probably know more than me too. And it's, I guess I'm good at what I do. I feel like I've honed what I do very well, but it's really limited. It's very, very narrow. But
I think that's what ends up happening though, right? Like, yeah,
that's true. That's specializing, isn't it? But it also scares me how much there is out there, and how much there is to learn, and you can never be a master of even your own genre, you know, because you could approach it in so many different ways, and you can only really use one approach at one time, I suppose, perhaps for your whole life. So yeah, I don't know. That's overwhelming. It's overwhelming to think
scary.
About.
I mean, okay, so you talk about your own sort of little niche and what you've specialized in. Would you like to talk us through what that might look like?
Oh, I can try. Yeah, so I started out, I keep using the term acousmatic throughout this. So I I went through the Bachelor of Composition at the Sydney Conservatorium, and when we were learning about music technology, this is when we didn't have the contemporary degrees or the kind of digital music stream. And so we learnt sort of from the experimental pathway through from musique concrète, which then kind of evolved into the more complex and more broad acousmatic music and tape music and all that sort of thing. And we did dabble in Max MSP and all that sort of thing. So for me, my favourite genre to work in has always been the acousmatic and radiophonic sort of very broad umbrella of music. So for me, that has mostly been in recorded audio. So just walking around with like a Zoom recorder and finding interesting sounds in the real world and then manipulating those into some sort of soundscape, and trying to tell some sort of programmatic story without necessarily ever being literal about it. So not with super recognizable sounds or only letting that kind of semantic listening have a glimpse through it at points. And it's always been very, I suppose, at times it is dark, but a lot of the time I like to think of my work as very like whimsical and tongue-in-cheek and definitely more about flinging things around and exploring a space. But it's not necessarily ever meant to evoke an emotion. And I was thinking about this a bit earlier, like music for me has never been an emotional outlet. It's more of a mindful practice where you follow a sound and see where it goes and you develop something, but it's not necessarily something that I use in my work to kind of communicate what I'm feeling or evoke something for the listener. It's more about taking them on a journey and I suppose exploring a sound together. How does that sound behave? Is it like an animal? And just taking them through the daily life of this sound, if that makes sense. It's like, it's just putting them in a scenario where we can explore sound together in a fixed media format. I'm definitely a fixed media composer, I've decided. So yeah, that's another rambling explanation of what I do.
Rambling is good.
Yeah, it feels time. Yeah. But recently I have been doing more rhythmic stuff. I'm delving into rhythm again. And that's been very interesting. I'm not sure if I'll stay there, but it's interesting to think about accumulation and dispersal of energy in a much more organised and quantized format. But I think that there are a lot of similarities actually in how we can approach it, and it can still be very experimental, but it gives more the listener more of a roadmap to cling on to as they're going through this journey. So it's interesting, and I think I'm in the middle of kind of reconciling this very arrhythmic and temporally flexible idea of electroacoustic music and finding something that's maybe a little bit more accessible to people who haven't had the same background or their mind hasn't been molded in the same way as I have. And so that's kind of where I'm at in my journey at the moment. And that's probably reflected in what I get my students to do as well in their major works.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's interesting that might sort of carry across, you know.
Yes. I think that as a teacher, my interests at that time are always reflected in my work. And I'm very aware of that. And I try not to let it colour what I'm doing too much, but it inevitably does. And I think that is the nice thing about having a mentor. You take on some of their interests and their passions.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah. So it's not always a bad thing, but you will also need to keep as unbiased as possible. So you're guiding a student, but you're never enforcing anything.
But I think when you are sort of studying with someone or learning from someone, you often will pick up little things from them. You know, I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing. I thought it was interesting you talking about how you weren't trying to sort of express feelings or emotions and that sort of stuff through music. Is composing music a very emotional process for you?
Yeah, no, I don't think it is. And I know this because I've thought about trying to express emotions through music before, especially this electroacoustic composition. And there's been times in my life where, you know, I've been going through, you know, grief or extreme happiness, and you want to say, okay, I'm going to write something that commemorates this moment. I'm going to write something dedicated to maybe someone I've lost, or I'm going to try and cement this success I've recently gone through in music so I remember it forever. But it's never worked out that way, and it feels really ingenuine for me as a composer. It just hasn't worked. And I think that's because for me, music is also always mindful. And I guess I'm thinking about mindfulness in the way that you take away worldly emotion and you let it flow through you, but it's much more of an observing state of mind, where it's not necessarily about letting emotions take over you, but it's about observing them and then letting them move away. And for me, music has always been about exploration of the sound itself. It's not necessarily what it's signifying. So I've tried to commemorate emotions through music, but that's not how it ever feels for me. So I've learnt to accept that, and now music is about the joy of the exploring of sound and what you can do with it and the creative kind of boundaries of that. So it's weird, super weird.
That's really fascinating, right? Because writing music for me is like the most cold, clinical feeling.
There you
I just
go.
sort of sit there. I don't sort of, it's weird. I just sort of hyper focus on what I'm doing. It's really clinical.
It's almost like that is how you can escape from the emotions of the world.
Yeah.
Yes, it's almost like it exists on a higher intellectual plane. Isn't that terrible? Isn't that a terrible way to put it? But it doesn't feel like that. It's very passionate. It's passionate, but it's not something that for
it's
me
not intensely emotional. It's not like...
No, that's it. It's hard to explain, but that's it.
It's really fascinating, because I spoke to a different composer ages ago, like last year. I was talking to her about her creative process and what writing music is like for her, and she says, sometimes it's so intense that she will be crying while she's writing, and it's like all about this sort of expression of what she's going through, or like or how she feels, and writing music is the sort of outlet for that, and that sort of helps. And I was like, I do not relate to that at all.
I agree, and I think that's so fantastic that it can be like that, but it's not how music feels to me either. I just think that's so fascinating that it can mean so many things to different people, but that even though it's not necessarily a reflection of emotion, it's still something we're just as passionate about, and it's so healing. But it's almost healing after the fact. It's healing to know, well, I've got this exploration, I'm really happy with this, but it's almost in a, like you say, a clinical,
it's like
almost detached way.
It's not in a like, this explores sort of my personality or like my inner demons or whatever. It's more like, I made this cool thing.
Yeah, it goes beyond, it's above and beyond personality. It's not something that can even be you using your sense of self as a parameter. Or maybe that just tells us something about electronic music and how cold and clinical it is compared to like instrumental music. I don't know.
Because this other composer I was talking to, like she, like most of her stuff that she writes is acoustic music, right?
Right.
And it's sort of more in that tradition, I guess. But do you think it does come across in the music that you write, that it does it feel cold to you, the stuff that you end up?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think, and that's something I have been exploring, because this has been on my mind lately. The piece that I'm currently writing is like a fairly short piece for the Minecraft world that you guys are currently building at the moment, and I'm really exploring this idea of evoking emotion in experimental electronic music. And is this something that I can actually create rules for? Is it about having kind of like that analog warmth in a sound? Is it having a really buzzy bass, or is it about putting in chords? Is it about having these kind of anecdotal sounds in there, like heavy breathing or crying? Or is it something that's more intangible, like it might be in instrumental music? Is it a particular harmonic interaction? So that maybe remains to be seen. I think in my earlier works, and yes, it is very clear that this is an exploration of what I can do, and maybe even in the artistic goal isn't completely concentrated, and it's just me kind of exploring the boundaries of what I can do as an artist. Noodling, yeah. So I think that I'm still working that question out if music isn't made with a particular emotion, can it still be emotional, or can it be seen as a very human kind of thing?
Well, this might be an exception to your general rule. But what about Paranoia in the Bush?
Oh, that one, that's actually, yeah, because that one was written to evoke an emotion, or
And
it
that
was
one
meant
did
to
make
commemorate
me feel
an emotion.
very
Paranoid.
uncomfortable, right? But when you were writing that,
Yeah.
did you feel paranoid? Or were you just,
You know what? I completely take it back. That is true. Paranoia in the Bush, when I wrote it, it made me remember these memories of being really scared and feeling very isolated while very lost on a bushwalk. So isn't that funny? That would be the exception for me.
Yeah.
And that was such an experiment, and funnily enough, it's probably like my most played work, because it does
really?
have that. It has probably been my most played or known about work, even though it was so different to the other approaches I had. The other interesting thing about that work was that I originally lost it. I lost the first draft of that work in a hard drive failure, so I had to completely rewrite it. So maybe it wasn't as in the moment as my other works are.
Yeah, true. That's interesting.
Yeah. So, I mean, wouldn't recommend that as a process in general.
Yeah, just corrupt your hard drive and then redo it.
Worked for that one though.
God.
Yeah. Oh, thanks for bringing that up. I forgot about that.
No, that's all right. I just remember that making me feel pretty uncomfortable, and I was like,
jittery.
well, this feels like a little exception here.
Yeah.
But I mean, you talk about this potentially being something that's related to electroacoustic and sort of electronic music, right? And I tend to agree to a certain extent. I mean, like, in terms of synthesis and just intricate electronic music, I'd say Autechre are some of my heroes, right?
Yep.
But a lot of their music is just spiky and sort of like, it feels more like it's about shapes and points and things than about sort of human stuff. And I think that's even a lot of the time even just expressed through the way they title their pieces. You know, it's just a bunch of numbers and crap.
Yes. Yep.
But I think that is something. Do you think maybe that's something to do with that you have these parameters that, like, regardless of what software you're using, it's something that's not human that's changing things, you know?
Yeah, we're not directing humans to make the sounds for us. It's very controlled, and it's software that's actually sounding out this stuff.
Yeah, and I mean, even with your automation curves and stuff, right? Like, if you just I mean, just do something really really obvious, but like, let's say you did put an automation curve on a filter.
Yep.
Just to turn the filter from 0 to 127 over 10 seconds, right? You could do that with an automation curve, or you could do that yourself by turning a knob, right?
Yeah.
If you were to map out what that knob did if you turned it, I don't think it will be a smooth line, right?
No.
So there's this, like, sort of, do you feel like that comes out? There's this sort of weird, uncanny perfection that comes sometimes from...
Yeah, I get what you mean. And you know, even when we do record these very, like, human-like gestures, like, you know, by mapping a parameter to, like, a knob or something, if it's not that smooth, we kind of pick it up as well as being, oh, you know, that wasn't very smooth, or they didn't automate that very well, and it kind of feels out of place almost. Like, there's almost no room for that organic interaction with the machine. And, like, maybe this is just my experience, but it's interesting that you brought up that kind of like Autechre and IDM genre as well, because yes, that's a stereotype, isn't it? It's that cold, clinical kind of investigative music that isn't necessarily dealing with human emotion.
I kind of love that stuff, though. I think it's
I love it too. And I think that it's really the same principle as what I am looking at in music. It's mindfulness, and it's focusing on shifting a few parameters to see what the results are, and then you know, forging forward with that, shifting a few more, and it's explorative. It's totally explorative. And I don't know, maybe it's also a thing about who's making the music or the tools we're using, but can it ever be as evocative and as human as people who are making music? That's not a question I know the answer to, and it's a huge philosophical question as well. It's like,
it's interesting. I
yeah,
just find it fascinating. I mean, I find the idea of like generative stuff, like setting up a system and then the system makes the music. I find that stuff really fascinating as well, because it sort of takes you out of it a little bit.
It does.
Like it just makes it in terms of like rather than a composer in like the sort of the way that people normally sort of think about composers. It's more like you're an architect almost.
Yeah,
you're sort of creating a space, all that sort of crap.
Yeah, you're an engineer.
Yeah, and that's really I just find that sort of fascinating.
It's like in what's that show? Is it Prometheus, where you have the engineers?
Oh, that's right. Yeah.
And they, I totally forget the synopsis now, but they make humans, and then the humans end up.
I can't remember. I haven't seen that movie for like 10 years. But
I need to watch it again. Anyway, that was a stupid metaphor. But
we're all about stupid metaphors here.
Yeah, totally. This is lo-fi convo.
Exactly.
Yeah, it is interesting. So again, the process that you're using, maybe that shifts you the kind of effect that you can have on people as well. Like, unless you were to build like an AI machine that could evoke human emotion and really draw on the heartstrings of its listeners, but that's a whole other thing.
Yeah, I mean, it's not to say that I was just mucking around in Max the other day and I was just hitting random parameters, and then it just from like random nothing, it just sort of generated this really beautiful soundscape. And I was like, well, that's interesting that partly because I never write pretty music, but it just came up with something that was really beautiful. And I think that was really fascinating that was just from hitting a button that randomized all the parameters, and this just sort of came up.
Totally.
It's like, I don't think it's like computers are incapable of writing beautiful music. I think that's like,
computers are capable of love.
Computers are capable of a lot more than we're willing to give them credence for, and I think that's really scary.
Yes, that's true.
Yeah. Anyway, unfortunately, we are running out of time.
That's true. We are.
I have just noticed, but yeah, Alexis's piece, "The Lonely Plane," will be part of our sound server installations event, which is on October the 2nd. So definitely buy a ticket for that. And yeah, thank you very much for coming on to the podcast with us, Alexis. It's always good
lovely
to have a talk.
I know, it's always good to chat.
Yeah, always good to chat, and like this time we can record it.
I know. Scared to listen back.
Oh, me too. I hate listening to my own voice. It's been a nightmare editing these. And as always, to those of you at home, thank you so much for listening to us. It really means a lot to have you listening and supporting experimental and strange, weird music experiments in such a strange, weird time.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. We will catch you next time. Bye-bye.